Hey everyone, welcome back to Life Lifters. Today is Friday. It's the last day of our tour through Rome, and I'm so excited that you kept coming back and joining me on this tour together. Well, the last stop is going to be the same as our first stop. We are going to visit the Colosseum one more time, but today we're going to look at one aspect of the Colosseum. And I want to just take you back to a moment when I visited the Colosseum this past summer. You know, you arrive there and you walk through the gates and you purchase your ticket and you got to go through security. And then you go up this large concrete and stone staircase. And there's this long hallway that you have to walk down. And there's all sorts of exhibits that are telling you about the history, and there's artifacts from the Colosseum there. And this hallway leads you down into an entranceway that opens up into the magnificent arena. And before you is the arena floor. And as you're walking towards that arena floor, it's like you can almost hear the roar of the crowd. You see the large seating areas that surround the arena floor. You see the stonework, and there's just this sense of awe as you're walking into the arena. But then I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks, something that just immediately silenced the roar of the crowd. And right before you walk out, you come face to face with a large cross. And when I saw that cross, I immediately thought about what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, that we are called to be living sacrifices for God. And so Paul writes this. He says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." You see, in the Old Testament, people would worship God and people would receive forgiveness of sin by sacrificing animals. But Jesus, he is the Lamb of God who came to take away the sin of the world once and for all. And so we no longer have to make animal sacrifices, but Jesus calls us to be living sacrifices for him. He calls us to live our lives in a way so that we offer ourselves as an act of worship to him. Jesus spoke about this in another way. In Luke chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves," sacrifice, must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. That's the living part. Jesus is telling us that we have to daily be a living sacrifice if we want to follow him. You see, the world tells you a lot of things. The world wants to program you. The world wants you to conform to its way of life. The world says things like, put yourself first. The world tells you things like, be selfish. Hate those who hate you. Do something if it feels good. Live your life how you want. But if you want to pick up your cross daily and be a living sacrifice, Jesus wants you to do the exact opposite. He wants you to put others first. He wants you to yield your will to God's will. He wants you to, instead of hating your enemies, he wants you to love your enemies. He wants you to flee temptation instead of just doing it because it feels good. He wants you to remain obedient to God the Father. And so Paul continues in verse 2 of chapter 12, and he says this, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So, how do you practically renew your mind? What does that mean? Well, I want to share an illustration with you, and that is that of a USB thumb drive. You're probably familiar with this. You probably even have one. And, this is basically a storage device. You can put all sorts of files on it. You can put photos and videos. You can put documents and spreadsheets. You can put all sorts of good files on this. But it is also possible for this to become corrupted, for malicious files to get on here and to do harm to your computer or maybe the other files that are on this thumb drive. And so the good news about a USB thumb drive is that it is rewritable. You can either delete files off of it or overwrite it, or you can completely just wipe it clean and start all over again. And our minds, they operate in a similar manner. Throughout the day, we make choices. We look at things, we listen to things, we say things, we ponder thoughts that come into our mind. These things, they all program our mind throughout the course of the day and over, in fact, a lifetime. Our minds are programmed. And some programming is good for us, but other programming is bad for us. And so the good news is this, that God can remove the bad programming, the bad stuff, and he can replace it with good stuff. He can renew our minds. And so we can renew our minds with good stuff like reading and studying the Bible, viewing these Life Lifter videos, attending church, listening to worship music, attending a small group, being a part of a community of other people who are like-minded. You can watch TV shows and movies that have a positive message instead of an immoral message. You could spend time with other Christians who can encourage you, and you can serve people not expecting anything in return. These are great ways to renew your mind, to fill your mind with great positive activities, good activities. And Paul tells us that the more that we renew our mind, the more we renew our mind with the things of God, the more we will be in tune with what God's will is for our lives. And Paul tells us that God's will is good, pleasing, and perfect, and there's nothing else like it. There's nothing else like being in the center of God's will. And so I want to encourage you. The next time you see a cross, to think of yours, to remind yourself, Jesus died on that cross, and he calls us to be a living sacrifice, those of us who are following him, because we have to deny ourselves and daily pick up our cross. And so I hope you find encouragement in that. I hope it's a good reminder for you. And I just want to review the things that we learned this week because they will help us to be those living sacrifices for God. And so I want to encourage you, do not be ashamed of the gospel. Share the good news of the gospel with the people in your life. I want to encourage you to trust God more in all situations, even when they look impossible and they're hopeless. Trust in God. Remember that you have been repurposed. You're no longer a slave to sin. You're no longer an instrument of wickedness, but you're now an instrument of righteousness. I wanted you to remember to change your perspective on trials and problems and see God's purpose being weaved in all things, not just the good things, but in all things. See God's purpose and seek God's purpose in your life. And lastly, I want to encourage you to renew your mind daily. Thanks so much for joining us this week. I'm so honored that you spent this week with me, and I'm glad that you guys are finding these Life Lifter videos helpful. I hope you're going to return next week. Pastor Vince will be doing another week of Life Lifters, and I want to just remind you guys, don't just go and have a great day, but go and make a great day.